The purpose of this presentation is to effectively explain the creation of my communication change project designed to become more aware of and to improve my critical listening and literacy skills. This project was a meaningful way for me to improve on my speaking and listening communication in a school setting because communication competence with myself and especially with my students is the key to happiness and creating a nurturing, positive classroom community. I will present my project findings and analysis based on my semester's interaction with 12th grade English students. This project was designed to improve my self-awareness in becoming better at listening for valid and reliable claims that my students articulate in verbal arguments in order to strengthen the students' claims and help them become aware of how they craft and defend their own arguments. Ideally, I designed this project to become increasingly aware of how I listen to claims posed by my students in order to challenge the validity of their arguments rather than blindly accepting them. I believe it is entirely necessary to constantly look for ways in which I can improve my own teaching, especially as a pre-service teacher, in order to help my students. To accomplish this, it is essential that I align my goals with goals that I set for my students, which must also align with the standards and the 6 shifts, especially shift 4, requiring more implementation of text-based answers. While I believe it is important to honor each student's attempt toward providing the correct answer, it is crucial that students learn how to successfully defend all claims, whether written or verbal. By improving my own critical listening abilities, I have noticeably strengthened students' claims by challenging how they support their arguments in order to make them more concise with valid and relevant evidence. At the beginning of this project, I realized that in order to achieve my goal for myself and for my students, I needed to first become aware of how and when I process student arguments. Before each new school day, I would write notes to remind myself of how to become aware of how I listen to my students. For example, I would make sure that I was listening to their use of textual-based evidence rather than listening if they made a verbal contribution to class discussion. By becoming increasingly attuned to listening to students' use of textual-based evidence, I was able to question the validity of their arguments, to classify the arguments as either opinions or statements that need more evidential support in order to improve how reliable their claims actually were. By monitoring my students' verbal arguments, I was able to train myself to become aware of how I listened to students' claims critically. In this way, I began to teach students to lawyer their opinions in arguable ways that would be hard to refute if they were able to use evidential support. Essentially, my own process of trying to improve my personal listening skills required me to focus on listening to students' speaking skills and the standards that they need to meet for speaking. By strengthening my students' speaking skills, I was also able to strengthen my own listening skills and theirs, the two of which go hand in hand. This required me to focus closely on the standards and explain them to my students. Since they were aligned with my own personal goals, they easily took to understanding and implementing them in daily class conversations, when I would model the practice of questioning the students and focus on teaching students the importance of listening to learn rather than learning to listen. To do this, I would evaluate the speaker's point of view and reasoning. The entire process focused on interpersonal communication. I would also model my own critical listening skills with the students in discussion setting while also allowing them to have smaller group discussion and even presentation, essentially because I wanted them to practice communication skills in different types of settings, especially professionally. One specific instance when I think my students really began to understand the importance of critical listening was during the implementation of a critical argument segment where students were required to write a text-based paper on a topic of their choice. One specific student created an argument on Dante's Inferno and had clearly not read enough of the novel before crafting his argument because he could barely do more than provide a plot summary for the class, and the only direct quotations he provided during this argument were from the first 30 pages alone. After his discussion, his peers responded to his argument by questioning some specific statements he made and challenging the argument's validity. His inability to effectively articulate the claims clearly illustrated to the teacher and to the rest of the class that he did not have sufficient knowledge of the story to make a superior claim to defend his initial claim within reason. Over the course of my time with these students and developing better interpersonal communication with them, I also knew it was important to strengthen my own intrapersonal communication. To achieve this, I would constantly remind myself that my goal for my students is to help them acquire and strengthen their own speaking and listening skills in order to empower them in ways that will benefit them outside the classroom and in the real world. Part of this goal was to teach my students how to become reflective listeners, which I would model for them by reflecting alongside them to show them that I truly value what I teach and that I hope they will learn to value it as well. Interpersonal communication has been key in self-monitoring my progress with my students. Reflection has the power to help us become aware of what we've been working on and how we can change in order to become better, brighter participants in a class community. I believe it is important for us to always reflect on learning in the classroom and to become metacognitive about what strategies we use to learn and listen best. To aid this reflection process, I created a rubric to monitor my critical listening progress and to help me become aware of how I listen so that I can become more attuned to improving my critical listening every single day. The most important aspect of this rubric was my reflection on the degree in which I am able to discern whether information is relevant and reliable. I have been able to document my progress by using this rubric weekly to assess my critical listening after being in the class, which I follow up by writing a reflection based on my performance on the rubric, what I did well, and what I could improve on for the next week. During my time in the classroom, I have had the opportunity to videotape myself teaching a lesson with my Irish literature class so that I can actually observe how I respond to my students so that I can assess myself on whether I am critically listening to the students or not. What I originally found that my placement was 12th grade English AP students, I was somewhat disheartened. After reflecting on my emotions and mentality toward the experience at the beginning of the semester, I realized that I wouldn't have a sad or withdrawn attitude toward this new experience where I'd be working with students, and began to reflect on this with the help of the UC Berkeley's Science of Happiness MOOC, which helped me to think of the idea for this project. By establishing a specific goal for my time at the school with the students, I began to focus my attention on improving my own communication skills to foster a positive relationship with the students. At the end of my time with my students, I nearly didn't get as far with them as I would have liked to, or would have been able to if I had been teaching the class every day.